We had some technical problems. The projector stopped working in the classroom where this was scheduled. So we're starting about 25 minutes late. So this is going to be a really quick run through of the Open Pedagogy workshop. And first question is, what is Open Pedagogy? And basically, it's a way of teaching in which students are involved in the creation rather than just the consumption of academic content. And the material they create is shared, at the very least, with members of the class, but often more broadly. Often it's a creation of public knowledge. It involves active learning because the students are actively engaged in working with material and creating content. And one of the nice things about it is, in the words of David Wiley, the founder of Lumen Learning, the assignments that students create are non-disposable. The typical assignments that many students do in their classes involve writing up something, submitting it into a learning management system, and then never seeing it again. With Open Pedagogy, students are creating something that has at least some degree of permanence, something that will last beyond the class period. And as one aspect that's often involved in this is that there's often this service learning component where they're creating something that other people may use, which gives the value of the work a bit more, it gives it more intrinsic meaning, intrinsic value, which makes students much more likely to take the project more seriously and to engage in the project more deeply. Some examples of that include annotating existing online content using something like Hypothesis and sharing those annotations more broadly. Blogs where students are writing something, could be their learning journey, it could be about some subjects, it could be a travel blog. There's many applications where blogging can be useful. It could be adding to a wiki, creating new content for a wiki, or creating an entirely separate class wiki on a project where there aren't very many resources out there. Students sometimes often create glossaries. We've had a number of those projects on our campuses in the past. And students can also do podcast projects. We'll have a workshop on that. Actually, we had a workshop on that a few days ago. Students could also create videos that are shared publicly. They could be instructional videos. They could be videos that are designed for students in middle school or secondary school, or it could be videos that are relevant for other college students. Or students could create, while they're engaging in research, they could share that research publicly. So if they're doing research studies, they can create knowledge that can then be shared with others. And students could also create some book projects. And there's some really good examples of that. Robin DeRosa was one of the first people to do this in a class in, I believe it was American literature, but many classes have gone on and used similar projects since then. My own students have created 3 book projects so far. So why might you consider using an open pedagogy approach? For me, one of the main reasons is student motivation. Students get really excited about this, they get really engaged with this, and they take on ownership of the project. And that results in an environment which is much more energizing for both students and faculty than a traditional classroom environment. Again, there's that non-disposable assignment aspect of it. The public audience is really helpful because when students know that someone else might be using the work, reviewing it, and also when they know that it's going to be out there and they can link to it in their LinkedIn profiles or in job applications, it gives them much more motivation to to put more effort into the project and to make it a more polished piece of work. There's that active learning involvement that we've already mentioned. But there's a few qualifications we should make right at the beginning that if you're going to do an open pedagogy project, it shouldn't be just for the sake of doing it. It should be very closely related to your course learning outcomes. One issue that you have to be aware of or that you have to consider is how to address student privacy concerns. Not all students would like to create content that's going to be shared publicly, or if they do, they might prefer that it remain anonymous. So you should provide either options that would not be public or give students options of creating work that is shared under a pseudonym or anonymously. And you also should think about how you're going to have students collaborate with each other. If they're going to be working in groups and if they're going to be working on a joint project, you have to come up with some way of arranging the tasks so that everyone is engaged in it. And also from the perspective of evaluating student work, some way in which you can evaluate the contributions of individual students and assess that. Some of that could be from peer assessment. Some of it could be doing something as simple as having students color code their contributions on drafts of the work so you can visually see which work was created by which student. You also should, in the process, if you're going to do a very elaborate project, provide sufficient scaffolding, because creating a video or significant video or creating a book project or even podcast might seem really intimidating. But if you scaffold the work, it becomes much more manageable. And it also helps keep students from procrastinating and holding off doing work until the end and then having panic set in. So providing feedback along the way, providing revision, and letting students make mistakes and correct them as part of the process is really helpful with everything that students do. But it's probably even more important if they're engaged in a more substantial or a larger open pedagogy project. Another issue that you need to address is copyright as well as intellectual integrity issue. If that's always an issue with work that students are creating and submitting, and students should be aware of that. But I think we've all run into cases where students will sometimes skirt the boundaries or go way beyond those boundaries. So reminding them of the importance of copyright and of making sure that any work used by others is cited is really important, because the last thing students would want is to have work out there on the web that someone else will claim as their own. The other issue, though, is when students create work, you need to determine what sort of copyright you will release this under. And a really common set of copyright or really common situation is to use one of the Creative Commons licenses. And I think that's coming up very shortly. And the other thing is, if you want students to create something that's going to last beyond the class, you have to make sure that there's some way of hosting it in a way that's sustainable. Storing things in the learning management system is not terribly helpful because those things tend to disappear as soon as the semester ends. So you need some platform that will allow the work to exist, at least for a while, beyond the class. And again, it's important to be able to evaluate individual contributions. And also, more and more content is digital, and students are likely to be creating digital content in the future. And teaching students and reminding them about digital accessibility requirements is really important. And this is a great opportunity to help students learn a little bit about the need for things like captions on any images or transcripts with videos and so forth. And the basic Creative Commons license, because of time limitations, we're not going to go through them in detail, but basically these are the most common ones. And if you go to creativecommons.org licenses, you can find out more about each of these. The most generous license is the top one, which is just the CC BY, which means that any work that students create can be used by anyone, commercial or non-commercial, as long as the students receive attribution, as long as they receive credit for their work. And as we move down, they get progressively more restrictive. Well, I guess we might as well talk about them a little bit. The share alike one requires that any content that you create can be used by other people as long as it's shared under the same Creative Commons license. The non-derivative requirement, the ND addition to that, means that the work has to be, can be used by anyone, but it has to be used in exactly the same format. It can't be rewritten, it can't be edited, it can't be merged into other work. It can't be used in other works in an altered format. That's really common when you're dealing with things like artwork or photography and so forth, because artists and photographers would not like to have their images edited by other people so that they do not represent the original work. Non-commercial restrictions means that anyone can use a work with appropriate attribution, but it cannot be used for commercial purposes. It can't be sold. And then you can combine those in different combinations. But again, go to the Creative Commons license and website, and they have a lot of information there, as well as embed codes you could put on documents so that the Creative Commons license would be visible. And you may also want to use a student release form for any work that they're going to share publicly, just so that you have a record that students have agreed to that particular license. And this is a sample form that was released under a Creative Commons license. So if this was an in-person workshop and we had people in the room, which I was hoping would happen, but not only did we have the projector not working, but no one was here for the session. We've done this a number of times, but these are things you may want to consider. What types of assignments are you using, and what types of open pedagogy projects might be good alternatives to the traditional assignments you've been doing. And there's a lot of resources at this website, openobjectives.org. Judy Littlejohn and I had done a conference presentation on this a few years back, and we periodically at least update this website with lots of examples of resources on open pedagogy. And if we go to the website just to get a feel for it, we could find open pedagogy research right here. And for each of these categories, there are examples of the categories, as well as resources that might be helpful in helping you use that. So if you go to student created books, here's some examples of that. And here's some examples of resources that describe how such projects can work. And here are some additional resources. And again, you're welcome to use any of these things. And that's all I have. If you have any questions about open pedagogy projects, please contact me, and we will, and I'll be happy to give you any assistance. But this website is a nice resource. I think it's a nice resource.